The United States and Israel have attacked Iran. What happened in the first 12 hours matters, because those opening hours tell you what kind of war this is, what the intent was, and how much each side wants the rest of the region to understand it. This did not begin as some small exchange that later spiraled out of control. It began with a coordinated strike package that Israel itself described as pre-emptive, and Reuters reported that the operation had been planned for months in coordination with the United States. That is important because it tells you straight away that this was not improvised, not reactive in the narrow sense, and certainly not a symbolic gesture. It was designed to hit early, hit hard, and change the strategic picture immediately. The timing also matters. In the days before the attack, Reuters reported that Donald Trump had set Iran a short deadline for movement on the nuclear issue, warning of very serious consequences if Tehran did not comply. Reuters also reported Steve Witkoff saying Trump was asking why Iran had still not capitulated. That language is worth pausing on. Capitulation is not the language of compromise. It is the language of coercion. So, when the strikes came at the end of that pressure window, on day 10, the message was fairly plain. Either the Iranians agreed, or force would be used to try to compel the outcome. Not exactly subtle. Reuters also reported in January that Trump's team was already discussing strikes meant to create conditions for regime change after the protest crackdown. The opening wave of missiles reportedly focused particularly on Tehran, but it did not stop there. Tehran, Karaj, Loristan, Tabriz, Kermanshah, Qom, and Esfahan all entered the picture early, which points to attacks across major cities and strategic sites rather than a single isolated strike. Reuters reported explosions in Tehran from the outset, while AP described the opening assault as broad enough to kill Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and trigger a massive regional escalation almost immediately. So, from the very start, the pattern did suggest something much bigger than a limited punitive operation. On the face of it, it looked very much like the opening move in a decapitation campaign, and, by extension, possibly a regime change calculation, whether openly admitted or not. President Trump spoke after the strikes began, and the tone was as you would expect. High on justification, heavy on threat, and very clearly framed around American security interests. Reuters later reported that demanding Iran's unconditional surrender, while AP reported that American and Israeli messaging around the operation focused not only on security threats, but on breaking Iran's governing and military structure. That is why the rhetoric matters. The words tell you what the military action is trying to become politically. And in this case, it was quite obvious that the goal was not simply to degrade a few capabilities and then go home. Now, the crucial thing here, and I think this is where a lot of lazy commentary falls apart, is that the Iranian government being brutal, repressive, and deeply hated by many of its own people does not mean that outside powers are acting from some saintly place either. Both things can be true. The regime can be oppressive and violent towards its own population, and the United States and Israel can still be acting according to their own strategic interests, their own red lines, and their own long-term agenda. You do not have to romanticize Tehran to understand that. In fact, it is probably better not to romanticize anyone. Reuters' own January reporting showed that some US officials were explicitly discussing military action in terms of inspiring renewed protests and shaping leadership change. That point becomes even more important once you look at what Iran had already been going through before the war began. Reuters reported that the January 2026 protests began over economic collapse and inflation, then quickly moved beyond economic grievances into direct anger at clerical rule. Within days, people were calling for an end to the Islamic Republic itself. Reuters later reported that the death toll had risen above 5,000 by the state's own verified count, with thousands more cases still under review. Britannica describes the 2026 protests as the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since the Woman, Life, Freedom movement of 2022-23, and before that, the 2009 Green Movement. So, yes, there is clearly a very large body of Iranian anger against the regime. That is real, and it needs to be taken seriously. But anger at the regime is not the same thing as unquestioning support for foreign intervention. That distinction is where much of the real human complexity sits. It is also worth remembering that this internal war did not begin in January 2026. Reuters reported in March 2024 that the UN fact-finding mission concluded Mahsa Amini's death in custody was unlawful and caused by physical violence from state authorities. Her death helped ignite the Woman, Life, Freedom protests in the first place. Two of the journalists most closely associated with bringing that story to the public, Niloufar Hamedi, who reported from the hospital, and Aleha Mohammadi, who reported for Amini's funeral, were jailed over their reporting. AP reported their imprisonment, and Reuters later reported that their original sentences were reduced on appeal to 5 years each. That matters because it tells you something basic about how the system behaves. Even reporting the truth can be treated as a security crime. And it did not stop there either. OHCHR said in March 2023 that more than 1,200 schoolgirls had been deliberately poisoned in attacks reported across 91 schools in 20 provinces after the first known incident in Qom on 30th of November 2022. UN experts said that many believed girls' schools had been targeted because girls had played such an active role in the protests. Whether one looks at custody deaths, jailed journalists, schoolgirls being poisoned, or protesters being shot in the street, the wider pattern is hard to miss. This was already a state at war with parts of its own society. It is also worth being very clear about what those protests cost. Reuters reported that security forces fired live ammunition indiscriminately, turning streets into what witnesses described as war zones, while Amnesty said forces used rifles, shotguns loaded with metal pellets and mass arrests, including of children as young as 14. The UN Human Rights Chief warned on February 27th that at least 8 people, including 2 children, had already been sentenced to death over the January protests, and that another 30 appeared to be at risk of the same fate. So when we say that speaking out in Iran can cost you your life, that is not rhetorical flourish. It is a fairly literal description of how the system has been functioning. And the punishment did not stop once the crowds thinned out. Iran Wire reported that officers were patrolling streets with rifles, setting up checkpoints, searching people's phones for videos and images, and warning protesters to surrender or face punishment. It also reported arrests in hospitals, thousands detained, forced confessions airing on IRGC-linked outlets like Fars and Tasnim, and what residents described as severe suffocation. A month later, Iran Wire said the internet had still not returned to normal, and that banking systems, transfers, and everyday life were still being disrupted as a form of chronic pressure after the crackdown. OHCHR warned in March 2025 that 2.5 years after the Woman, Life, Freedom protests began, the Iranian government was still escalating surveillance and repression in a concerted effort to crush dissent. So yes, there was already an internal war on the Iranian people long before the bombs started falling from outside. That internal war is also where the tension between ordinary Iranians and the IRGC really sits. Reuters has reported for years on how the guards dominate security and large sections of the economy, and in this war, it is reported that the IRGC tightened its grip on wartime decision-making even after losing senior commanders. During the January unrest, Iran Wire reported IRGC intelligence and affiliated outlets being central to arrests, accusations, and forced confession narratives. So, when many Iranians speak about the regime, they do not mean one abstract theological structure. They mean a lived system of clerics, security services, the guards, intelligence organs, courts and propaganda that has spent decades disciplining them by fear. As the strikes continued, the communications picture inside Iran deteriorated badly. Reuters reported earlier in January that internet and phone lines had been blocked during protests, and Reuters reporting from this war described Tehran in a state of terror, with sporadic connectivity, panic, damaged utilities, and enormous difficulty for residents trying simply to find out what was happening. Iran Wire also reported that journalists in Iran were facing bombardment, intimidation, and a growing information blackout. It is worth remembering that the people closest to the events are often the people with the least ability to communicate clearly in real time. So, when people online start posting with absolute certainty about every blast site, every casualty figure, and every alleged hit, verification becomes central before commentary does. The point is even more important in a country where sensitive investigations are tightly controlled by the state itself. The UN Special Rapporteur reported in 2024 that Iran denied him entry to the country, and the Human Rights Council has repeatedly had to call on Tehran to cooperate fully with the international fact-finding mission. In practice, that means investigators often have to work from testimony gathered outside Iran, satellite imagery, preserved digital evidence, and witness accounts rather than operating freely on the ground. So when the regime tells its own story about abuses, there are often very few independent ways to test it from inside the country itself. In a conflict like this, where the internet is patchy, state narratives are flying in all directions, and Telegram is full of clips with almost no context, you have to be disciplined. Bellingcat's basic verification approach remains the best one. Geolocate the footage, establish when it was recorded, compare visible landmarks and background features, and do not assume that because a clip is everywhere, it is therefore real. In this kind of war, recycled footage travels almost as quickly as missiles. And it is worth saying plainly that this is also an information war. Iranian state media and IRGC-linked outlets push one line. US and Israeli official briefings push another. And broadcasters operating in Western and Gulf media ecosystems come with their own framing, incentives, and blind spots. That does not make every report false. It does mean no serious viewer should treat any single stream as holy writ. Within those first hours, the strikes also appeared to carry a decapitation logic in the most literal sense. Reuters reported that Khamenei was killed on Saturday, February 28th, in the opening US-Israeli airstrikes while he was in office. And AP later reported that Iranian state TV announced his son, Mojtaba, as successor. Reuters graphics and follow-up reporting also identified key figures killed around the same phase of the attack, including Defense Minister Aziz Nazirzadeh, Chief of Staff Abdulrahim Mousavi, Senior Advisor Ali Shamkhani, and Mohammad Shirazi, who headed the Supreme Leader's military bureau. So even if one takes a cautious line and avoids jumping ahead rhetorically, there is no getting around the fact that the opening hours targeted the apex of the Iranian system. Now, it is tempting at this point to assume that if you remove the Supreme Leader and several senior figures around him, the whole thing begins to collapse. But that is not really how the Islamic Republic of Iran works. Britannica notes that the Islamic Republic built a system in which the Supreme Leader sits above formal institutions. Yet those institutions still exist, and still manage continuity even if the Supreme Leader is removed. Britannica's entry on the Supreme Leader and Reuters' current reporting both make clear that the Assembly of Experts has the constitutional role in choosing a new Supreme Leader. And Reuters has reported that a temporary leadership arrangement and succession process began immediately. So however dramatic the death of Khamenei is, the state has not simply vanished with him. It has moved into succession. That is a different thing entirely. And that is the first major lesson of the opening 12 hours. Decapitation is not the same as collapse. Iran's system is deeply entrenched, institutionalized, and built with continuity in mind. Reuters reported that some Iranians grieved while others celebrated, and Iran Wire described scenes of dancing, relief, and red clothing among opponents of the regime, alongside mourning among supporters. That makes sense. Khomeini's legacy was one of repression, militarization, executions, and decades of holding the country in a chokehold. Reuters noticed that the January crackdown that killed thousands had been authorized under his rule, and Britannica says he consolidated near-absolute authority in the office of the supreme leader while militarizing the state and empowering the IRGC. So yes, for many Iranians there is a bitter kind of celebration in his death, bound up with grief, fear, and the anxiety of seeing their own country bombed. The emotional truth is not tidy. Relief that he is gone, and uncertainty about what comes next. Meanwhile, Iran's retaliation came quickly and did not stay confined to Israel. Reuters reported missile fire across Gulf states, including the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain, while Jordan also intercepted missiles. AP described the exchange as severe enough to leave passengers stranded worldwide, oil prices rising, and what had once looked like bilateral confrontation now spreading across multiple fronts and multiple states. This is another point worth being very clear on. Once Iran was hit at the centre, its answer was not to keep the conflict neat. Its answer was to widen the map immediately. That is how you signal that the cost will not be carried by one capital alone. There is also a very practical reason Iran would want to destabilise the Gulf. Reuters reported that the United Arab Emirates bore the brunt of the first 48 hours of missile strikes, with airports, ports, and oil infrastructure particularly exposed, and that missiles hitting Doha, Dubai, and Manama were also striking at the Gulf's image as a stable financial, investment, and tourism hub. Reuters also reported that tanker traffic through Hormuz collapsed towards a standstill, with oil and gas flows threatened and global markets hit immediately. So, from Tehran's point of view, destabilising the Gulf is not only military retaliation, it is financial pressure. If the GCC begins to feel that this war is wrecking aviation, ports, tourism, insurance, shipping, and investor confidence, then those same states have every incentive to pressure Washington to bring the temperature down. That links directly to Hormuz and the wider area of making this economically painful for everyone involved. At the same time, the civilian dimension began to emerge almost immediately, and it is impossible to discuss the first 12 hours honestly without including it. OHCHR experts said that a girls' primary school in Minab was struck during the attacks on February 28th, reportedly killing at least 165 schoolgirls and injuring many others. Reuters later reported that a US investigation believed it was likely US forces were responsible, though it had not reached a final conclusion, and Reuters also confirmed from archive material that the school stood adjacent to an IRGC compound. So there are two things to hold at once here. First, we do not yet have a final public investigation settling responsibility beyond doubt. Second, the site was a functioning school full of children, and the scale of the horror is not really in dispute. OHCHR said very plainly that schools are civilian objects and that intentional attacks on educational buildings not being used as military objectives are war crimes. It is also worth adding one more layer here, because this is part of the moral confusion many Iranians are living through. The IRGC and the wider security apparatus have themselves been responsible for appalling violence against children, girls, and young people inside Iran. Reuters' January reporting and the UN Human Rights Chief warning on February 27th showed that children were among those killed in the protests and among those facing death sentences afterward. Amnesty said children as young as 14 were detained and abused in the crackdown. So yes, the Islamic Republic is absolutely capable of very serious atrocities against its own population and has committed them repeatedly. At the same time, many Iranians have also watched Israel's conduct in Gaza and do not simply hand it moral credit either. Which is why, in cases like Minab, many people refuse to rush to clean certainty before a proper investigation. They have seen too many lies from too many directions. And that leads into the next uncomfortable point. It is true that Iranian civilians do not have widespread bomb shelters, and it is true that internet blackouts, economic collapse, electricity problems, water insecurity, and shortages of basic goods all make wartime survival harder. But it is also important to say clearly that much of this is not new. Iran's people have already been living under fear, scarcity, and coercion for decades. And the regime itself used blackouts, repression, and the criminalization of dissent as daily tools of rule. That is why reports from inside Iran, including through Iran Wire and Reuters interviews, show something more complicated than simple panic. There is fear, absolutely. There is death, anxiety, and destruction. But there is also, for some, a grim sense of hope. The sense that if the regime can finally be shaken, then enduring more fear may be worth it because life under the regime was already a kind of war. That does not make the bombing humane. It does explain why some Iranians are willing to endure it in the hope of change. There is also the nuclear and technical backdrop, which again matters because it explains why so much of the language around this war has been framed as necessity. The IAEA said in early March that Iran continued to facilitate access to facilities unaffected by the June 2025 attacks, but had not provided the reports or access required under its safeguards agreement for affected facilities and associated nuclear material. That does not prove every military claim made by Washington or Tel Aviv. What it does show is that the nuclear file was already operating under incomplete visibility and deep mistrust before this war began. So the opening attack landed in a context where transparency had already broken down, and that in turn made it easier for each side to argue the worst about the other. Legally, the first 12 hours also matter because they set the tone for everything that follows. The ICRC explains that the conduct of hostilities is governed by the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. Civilians and civilian objects are protected. Attacks expected to cause excessive civilian harm relative to the concrete and direct military advantage are prohibited, and feasible precautions must be taken before and during the attack. OHCHR has also stressed in this conflict that attacks directed at civilians or civilian infrastructure or indiscriminate attacks can amount to war crimes. So however much one detests the Iranian regime, and there are many reasons why people do, that does not suspend the laws of war. It also demonstrates something else. It would have been extraordinarily difficult, probably impossible, for unarmed Iranian civilians to dismantle the IRGC on their own. Reuters reported that even US and Israeli planners did not believe air power alone could topple the Islamic Republic. That protesters were heroic but outgunned, and that the opposition lacked a broadly accepted leadership. The Iranian people were and are facing a security state without an army of their own. There is a broader historical layer here too. Britannica's account of the 1979 revolution makes clear that the Islamic Republic did not simply appear out of nowhere. It emerged from revolution, opposition to the Shah's autocracy, Western interference, economic hardship, and repression. But the foreign interference people in Iran remember most sharply begins earlier, with the 1953 US and UK-backed coup against Mossadegh that restored the Shah. That episode helped shape decades of mistrust toward Western power and was later folded into the revolutionary story the clerics used to legitimize themselves. At the same time, Encyclopedia Iranica makes clear that Iranian identity is much older and deeper than the current regime. Iran passed through Islamic conquest and Arab influence while retaining its language, culture, and civilizational continuity in a way many neighboring societies did not. That matters because the IRGC does not represent all Iranians, and the Islamic Republic is not the same thing as Iran. One of the central tensions in this war is that the regime speaks in the name of Iran, while many Iranians experience the regime as the force that has spent decades suffocating Iran from within. Those two things are not the same. So, what really happened in the first 12 hours? A US-Israeli strike, coordinated in advance and launched at the end of a coercive deadline, hit Iran's center of power and carried the clear appearance of a decapitation campaign. Tehran and other cities were struck. Khomeini was killed alongside senior figures around him. Communications inside Iran were cut back to a minimum. Iran answered not by containing the fight, but by spreading it through Israel and across the Gulf. And underneath all of that sat the deeper truth. Many Iranians may want an end to this regime, but that does not mean they are being offered a neat, pure, or humane route to that outcome. That is the reality of the first 12 hours. Not a clean liberation story, not a clean security story either. A coordinated opening blow, a fast regional retaliation, a state under blackout, children already dead, and a war that announced itself from the very first day as something much larger than a single exchange of strikes. In other words, by the time the first 12 hours were over, this had already become the sort of war that no one can fully control, but everyone will try to narrate in their own favour. Which, sadly, is often how these things go.